Seller's Real Property Disclosure Statement. This is a Hawaii Association of Realtors standard form. By law, the seller must disclose to a buyer when selling their home. This document is a complete document that the seller fills out with all the knowledge that they would have pertaining to their home. So by the time that they bought the house to the time that they're selling it, whatever has happened from that time period that they are aware of would need to be disclosed in this disclosure. Even things that they may have heard about from prior before they even knew about it. If it was a material effect, they would need to disclose it. This first section here, it says information obtained from public records may be completed by listing broker. This section here that's boxed in can be completed by the listing broker. However, the rest of the document must be completed by the seller. This is basically what it is a seller's disclosure statement, not a broker disclosure statement. So you would be able to fill all this information out yourself, but then you would need to give it to a seller to complete. So this first section here, you would just simply type in the name of the seller. And if there was more than one, you would put that. Put the address in, the tax map key, the county zoning, whatever that is, a state land use designation. If you don't know that, that can be obtained from the MLS sheet by looking here at the MLS sheet. Let's see, you've got zoning R5 and R5. There are two different ones. One is the city and county zoning and one is the land use ordinance. So in order, you would go 05 R5, go back to your disclosure statement, and you would put in R5 and R5 and whether or not it's fee simple or leasehold, and you would be the licensee. And brokerage firm would be the company, Elite Pacific Properties. The rest here is really, once you fill this out, then you can send this to your client to fill out. When is a good time to send this to your client to fill out? That is a good question, and that would be, the answer to that would be, make sure that when you take a listing that you give this to your client upon the listing presentation. Maybe you might want to wait till after you get the listing signed, but whatever the case is, give it to them at the beginning of a listing rather than giving it to them as soon as you get an accepted offer. There's kind of a flip side to that, but basically once you give them the disclosure, then they have plenty of time to fill it out, because it is kind of comprehensive and it would take a lot of time for the seller to fill it out, and there might be questions that they need to ask, that sort of thing, and maybe even have to dig through records to get information about warranties and things like that. So you want to give your seller a pretty good amount of time to gather all the information so that it is an accurate form when you give it to the buyer. A reason why you may not want to do it so soon in advance is because a seller disclosure statement is only good for 6 months. If, let's say, you give it to them at the beginning of the listing and then 6 months later you still don't have an accepted offer, and then 7 months later you do get an accepted offer, your client's going to have to refill the whole thing out all over again. And it's also possible that the disclosure statement may have had a revision in that time frame. But on the safe side, it would be best to just give it to them from the get-go, get them used to filling it out, because even if they had to redo it later, they can just copy and rewrite it onto a new document. And then that way it also gives you some insight as to what is either wrong with the house, or maybe there's some things that you need to explain during your showings. All of this information can come to light at the head of the listing rather than coming to light later when you're in escrow and there's all these surprises. So that's pretty much what you should do, is give it to them from the beginning, and then if for some reason you haven't gone into escrow within 6 months, you'll have to just redo it. Now as we go kind of down further here, one of the first questions here is, if not presently owner occupied, what is the date of the seller's last visit? So if the seller's not actually living in the home, a buyer's going to want to know when was the last time they came to the house. A lot of times sellers are not you don't go to the house, they don't see the house, or maybe they live on the mainland, and they don't know what's gone on while they've been gone. Maybe it was tenant occupied and there might be some things wrong with the house that they're not even aware of. that will help out a lot when you tell the buyer when was the last time the seller saw the house. If the seller has just been in the house like over a week ago and they're saying not to my knowledge on a bunch of stuff, and when you're doing your inspections, you see a lot of things that the seller should be aware of, it might set off a bit of a red flag for you. So again, if you're representing a seller, you're going to make sure that you have your seller put in the last date of the visit. You might even want to sit with your seller while you go through this because they might have questions about things, but it is pretty self-explanatory if they do read it. This next section here talks about general instructions. It explains how to answer the questions. If you answer any yes questions, where you need to fill out your explanations. If you don't know something, to put not to my knowledge. Whenever I send this to a seller, I always like to give the instructions of please fill this out to the best of your ability. If you do not know something, it's best to put not to my knowledge rather than answer yes or no, because if you're not sure, you don't want to say yes and then something happens where the buyer comes back and says, well, you said yes to this question and you really weren't sure. You might have a little bit of a hard time getting out of a situation. Or if, let's say, you say adamantly no, there were no permits done on the home prior to your living there, and you say adamantly no, and there really were permits done, and you kind of weren't really sure, but you said the word no, it might cause problems later if a buyer were to come back and say, hey, there were permits on here, but you said no, and they might, something that you could get sued over. So if you're absolutely not sure, in any case, put not to my knowledge, which would be the NTMK. And I always make sure I tell people, please put that rather than answering definitively yes or no. Okay, now we go into the section here, defects or repairs. These are just simple check boxes. If any of these boxes are checked, there needs to be a description written about it on page 4 in the section H. And the reason why is because even if you check it here, a buyer is going to want to know, well, okay, if there were any repairs or defects about this, I wouldn't want to know what those were. So let's say you check off appliances, they have no idea what appliance was affected. Maybe it was a refrigerator, maybe it was a stove, whatever the case may be. So let's say your seller checks off appliances, they're going to need to go to page 4 of this document and number it, number 4, appliances, and then they will have to explain. So let's say, for example, it was a refrigerator ice maker that was broken, or maybe it's still broken. They would say number 4, God, I'm drawing a blank here, appliances, that it would be the refrigerator ice maker is broken. They would have to explain it here. That way, a buyer knows that if they see a checkbox on that first page, to directly come here and see what it specifically is. And then that would be the place where the seller would fill that out. Now, they can handwrite it out, they could type it in, but this is not a fillable form, so technically they're probably going to have to print it out, fill it out by hand, and then fax it. So again, there are several different things here. They may call you and ask you questions about anything, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory, this part here. Okay? And then going on to the next page, we're into a different section now called General. And do any of the following conditions exist? If yes, use the same number and describe in section H. So again, if any of the boxes here are checked yes, you'll need to go to page 4, number this, and then make your explanation. There are some items here that if it says, if you do check yes, and the next question is, if you answered yes, let's see if I can find one of those. If yes, are there any violations? Okay, this one right here. Is the property subject to any recorded or unrecorded land lease? If yes, are there any violations of the land leases? In that case, sometimes you may see a seller check off yes and answer the question here, but not number it on page 8. And in some cases, that might be okay. Now, one of the most important things to think about after your client has filled this out is that, have they checked every box? Is every box accounted for? You need to make absolute certain that once you get this back from your client, that every box is accounted for, unless it's not applicable. The reason why is because if there's a mistake made or anything is not checked and you receive it, you technically can send that over to a buyer, but it would be deemed incomplete. And if you do send it over to the buyer as an incomplete document, you're not theoretically delivering a completed document, so you cannot start the clock ticking from that point. It also is reflected in the purchase contract under the I section that if there's any inaccurate information or any discrepancies with the seller disclosure, that there's a period of time that a buyer may cancel if that's the case. So you got to make sure that everything is checked out and accounted for. Not only that, but every single number that's checked yes must be explained. So they may have checked the box, but then maybe they didn't check it off or explain it on page 4 of the seller disclosure. And if that's the case, if that's not there and you need to turn it back into your seller to complete, then you know you don't have a completed disclosure. So as soon as you notice that anything is missing or inaccurate, you need to send it right back to the seller and have them correct it, so that you're not delaying anything. And try to get your client to give this to you at least within 2 days of the time frame to deliver to a buyer. That way you have a good period of time to make corrections or counsel your client. Okay, so I think if you were to just go through here and just read the questions, you'll kind of understand what they're asking for. There might be some things in here that maybe you don't even understand, and that would be something that you can call your broker or talk to anybody that you're working with to maybe help you with how to answer some of these questions. Now, as we go a little bit further here, you're going to notice a section that talks about condos. Did I just pass that? If you are working with a single family home, there is a section here that's specific to condos that you would not need to fill out. Here it is, F section, Condo Specific. So you wouldn't necessarily need to check off any of these boxes if it's not a condo. Talking about the utilities, one of the big things to make double check on is this section here where it talks about the electric power. If you have Hawaiian Electric, a buyer is going to want to know what the last 3 months are, the last 3 billing, so that they can see a pattern of electrical use and what it costs to run the electricity in that house. And a lot of times people will just put in numbers here, but you need to put the month in here as well. So when you get this back, if it's blank, you got to send it back. If it has just the month in there or just the amount, you're going to need to make sure that you have your client complete this month and year and then the amount. Okay? And if there's anything else that a seller feels that they need to disclose here that maybe was not present on this form, you will want to make sure that they add it to the H section. Now, if for some reason later down the road they find something new and they need to disclose something new, you could just simply put an addendum to this that would just say an update to the seller disclosure statement and then whatever the new disclosure may be. It's very important that this get delivered in a timely manner to the buyer because this also affects the home inspection. If there were any type of defects or any type of repairs made to any of these things here, it's very important that a home inspector sees it. That way they can double check that everything was done appropriately. So if you're representing a buyer and you received the seller disclosure, you're going to want to make sure you deliver this right away to you're going to want to deliver this right away to your home inspector so that the home inspector can double check that if there was any modifications made to, let's say, the ceiling fans or maybe the gutters, that things were done properly. Also, if anything were done without permits, you'll want to make sure that you ask for those permits.